If I had my life to live over again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. A man who dares to waste 1 hour of time has not discovered the value of life. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little, not those who know much, who so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin. We stopped looking for monsters under our bed when we realized that they were inside us. The love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. I am not apt to follow blindly the lead of other men. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I for one must be content to remain an agnostic. The highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. An American monkey, after getting drunk on brandy, would never touch it again, and thus is much wiser than most men. Blushing is the most peculiar and most human of all expressions. Intelligence is based on how efficient a species became at doing the things they need to survive. One general law, leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely, multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. In the long history of humankind, and animal kind, too, those who learned to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. Besides love and sympathy, animals exhibit other qualities connected with the social instincts which in us would be called moral. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. As man advances in civilization, and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. But I am very poorly today and very stupid, and I hate everybody and everything. One lives only to make blunders. Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends. The following proposition seems to me in a high degree probable, namely, that any animal whatever, endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience, as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well, or nearly as well developed, as in man. For, firstly, the social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. We can allow satellites, planets, suns, universe, nay whole systems of universe, to be governed by laws, but the smallest insect, we wish to be created at once by special act. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. Great is the power of steady misrepresentation. I see no good reasons why the views given in this volume should shock the religious views of anyone. Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity. More humble, and I believe truer, to consider him created from animals. For the shield may be as important for victory, as the sword or spear. Freedom of thought is best promoted by the gradual illumination of men's minds which follows from the advance of science. There is no fundamental difference between man and animals in their ability to feel pleasure and pain, happiness, and misery. To kill an error is as good a service as, and sometimes even better than, the establishing of a new truth or fact. It is always advisable to perceive clearly our ignorance. I am not the least afraid to die. To suppose that the eye with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I confess, absurd in the highest degree. The difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, should not be considered subversive of the theory. We are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with truth as far as our reason permits us to discover it. False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long, but false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, for everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness, and when this is done, one path towards error is closed and the road to truth is often at the same time opened. We are always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps. The very essence of instinct is that it's followed independently of reason. The loss of these tastes, for poetry and music, is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. We will now discuss in a little more detail the struggle for existence. A scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone. Nevertheless, so profound is our ignorance, and so high our presumption, that we marvel when we hear of the extinction of an organic being, and as we do not see the cause, we invoke cataclysms to desolate the world, or invent laws on the duration of the forms of life. Origin of man now proved. Metaphysics must flourish. He who understands Baboon would do more towards metaphysics than Locke. Wherever the European had trod, death seemed to pursue the aboriginal. I think it inevitably follows, that as new species in the course of time are formed through natural selection, others will become rarer, and finally extinct. The forms which stand in closest competition with those undergoing modification and improvement will naturally suffer most. We cannot fathom the marvelous complexity of an organic being, but on the hypothesis here advanced this complexity is much increased. Each living creature must be looked at as a microcosm, a little universe, formed of a host of self-propagating organisms, inconceivably minute and as numerous as the stars in heaven. I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can. In conclusion, it appears that nothing can be more improving to a young naturalist, than a journey in distant countries. The question of whether there exists a creator and ruler of the universe has been answered in the affirmative by some of the highest intellects that have ever existed. Among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceed in sublimity the primeval forests undefaced by the hand of man, whether those of Brazil, where the powers of life are predominant, or those of Tierra del Fuego, where death and decay prevail. Both are temples filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved, and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. But natural selection, as we shall hereafter see, is a power incessantly ready for action, and is immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts, as the works of nature are to those of art. Natural selection almost inevitably causes much extinction of the less improved forms of life and induces what I have called divergence of character. False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long, but false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, for every one takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. A grain in the balance will determine which individual shall live and which shall die, which variety or species shall increase in number, and which shall decrease, or finally become extinct. Only picture to yourself a nice soft wife on a sofa with good fire, and books and music,